I'll ask the same question of you all that I asked of the kids. Who ate breakfast today? Who's going to eat lunch today? Some of you aren't eating. I'm not seeing hands. Either that or I need to take a pulse check. But yeah, we live in a culture where we like to get together and eat. According to TripAdvisor, there are over 300 restaurants in Billings. 300 restaurants for 120,000 people. I don't know what the ratio is, but that's not bad. Yeah. Right? And they're restaurants of all different shapes and sizes with all sorts of different menus and food. And people go there and they eat. Whenever I get together with people, it's typically over coffee, over lunch, or over dinner. The chamber, for their business after hours, they make sure there is food and drink there to facilitate connection and conversation. We get together after funerals for a meal. We get together after weddings for a meal. We celebrate birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, promotions, retirements, all sorts of special occasions with meals. Right? We like to eat. And then I haven't even touched on Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, and those other times where we say, ooh, we need to get together and have a big meal. We like to eat. And Jesus liked to eat. We heard that in our gospel reading. We paged through the Gospels. He ate with Simon the Pharisee. He had a meal with Mary and Martha on Palm Sunday before he's getting ready to head into Jerusalem. He has a meal with Lazarus, and Jesus brings his disciples along for that meal. He had that meal on the night when he was betrayed, celebrating Passover with his disciples. And he had a meal with Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was also a tax collector. He was the wee little man, if you remember the Sunday school song. And he was so short that the crowd that was gathered around to hear Jesus, he couldn't quite see, so he climbed a tree. And Jesus saw him up in the tree. Who wouldn't notice that, right? And Jesus didn't wait for an invitation. He said, Zacchaeus, I'm coming to your house today. And Zacchaeus threw a party for Jesus. He brought all his tax collector and sinner friends together. And as Jesus speaks at the end of that meal, he said, today salvation has come to this household, because he too is the son of Abraham. The Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. Jesus came to redeem and restore all things. He came to make all things new. As he kicked off his ministry, Matthew in his biography writes, Jesus said, change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Change your hearts and lives. Here comes the kingdom of heaven. Jesus comes to redeem, to restore, to make things brand new once again. And that's what he did for Zacchaeus. And that's what he did for a different tax collector. One that, as we listened to our gospel reading from Luke 5, we heard called by the name Levi, but if you bump into him in the other gospels, his name is Matthew. And this is how things got started. Jesus went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at a kiosk for collecting taxes. Jesus said to him, follow me. Levi got up, left everything behind, and followed him. Then Levi threw a great banquet for Jesus in his home. A large number of tax collectors and others sat down to eat with them. As I said before, Jesus was a different kind of rabbi. Most rabbis, most teachers in Jesus' day, they would set up shop in some prominent place. At a gate, on a street corner, in a place where people would gather, and they would teach there, and they would hope to impress people with their teaching, and they would gain followers. They would attract people in that way. But as Luke records this, he says Jesus went out. Jesus doesn't wait for people to come find him. He doesn't wait for people to be attracted by his teaching. He goes and he finds his disciples. We've seen this with Peter, James, and John, and now we see it with this tax collector, Levi, also known as Matthew. And so Jesus goes up to his tax collecting booth. And while tax collectors, they were Jewish people who were working for the occupying government, the Roman governments. And tax collectors were known for extracting a little more money than was owed the government. Like in the case of Zacchaeus, he promised to pay people back, I think, 4 times of what he owed them. He had amassed a good amount of wealth out of this tax collecting business. And so tax collectors, to say they were frowned upon it just doesn't go far enough. They were despised. Okay? Nobody wanted to be caught with a tax collector because they were seen as a traitor. They were seen as somebody who was victimizing the people. And yet, that's who Jesus goes up to. And he goes up to Matthew and he says, "Follow me." And Matthew says, let me think about it. Now, what's involved? Oh, why don't you tell me more? And he didn't say any of those things, did he? He got up and followed Jesus. He could have said those things. He could have said, I need some more information. Let me know what this is that I'm about to get into. But he got up. He left everything behind and followed him. And then he throws this big party. He invites all his tax collecting friends. They're probably some of the only friends he had because the tax collectors, nobody else wanted to be around them, so they kind of probably had to hang out together. And then there were others that we find out the Pharisees call sinners. People who didn't measure up. They didn't have their act together. They were those people. That's the people that Matthew invites to his house to meet Jesus. That's an interesting strategy. Because today, it would be, well, Jesus, what's your speaking schedule? What auditorium are you going to be in next week? What time are you speaking next? Where are things at? And I'll see if I can bring some people to listen to you. But Matthew didn't do that. He threw a party. He invited friends, and they got to meet Jesus. And Jesus doesn't seem to be bothered by being with tax collectors. He doesn't seem to be bothered by being with sinners, by people who don't have their act together. The wedding held in Cana. That was a week-long feast with a lot of alcohol. And people were drunk at the end of that when Jesus performed his first miracle. And yet Jesus doesn't seem to be bothered by being among those people either. He just went out. And he got welcomed in. Welcomed in to this great feast. Now, eating is part of our pattern. It was also a big part of the pattern, the calendar year for the Jewish people. We know that they celebrated Passover, that time when they would get together annually and remember God rescuing them from slavery in Egypt and taking them out across the Red Sea, conquering the Egyptians with those 10 plagues. And it was at that meal that Jesus gives us this meal. It was at that meal, that Passover meal, on the night when Jesus was betrayed, when he picked up a piece of bread, he said, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And then a little while later, at the end of the meal, after supper, he took a cup that had wine in it, and he said, "This cup is my blood, it's the new covenant, given and shed for you and for many for the forgiveness of sins. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me." And as we gather on Sundays, we, again, get to eat with Jesus as he welcomes us to his table, as he serves us his body and blood with bread and wine to forgive us for our sins. The Jewish people also got together to kick off the new year with Rosh Hashanah. They got together to celebrate Purim. We just wrapped that up. It's a study of, it's a feast that comes out of the story of Esther and how God worked through Esther and her cousin Mordecai to prevent the Jewish people from getting annihilated. And they celebrate with a big feast, a big party with food and with drink. And they make a mockery of the enemies of God's people that were in that story as they retell and celebrate and share that story. Meals are markers. They're not only something that nourish our body, but they nourish our being. They nourish our relationships. And they're part of how we live life. And so it's no mystery to me why Isaiah, as he paints a picture of the next life, why he paints a picture of a meal. In Isaiah 25, he writes these words, "On this mountain the Lord of heavenly forces will prepare for all peoples a rich feast, a feast of choice wines, of select foods rich in flavor, of choice wines well refined. He will swallow up on this mountain the veil that is veiling all peoples, the shroud enshrouding all nations. He will swallow up death forever." God has a meal planned for us. And not just any meal. Not just instant oatmeal. But a meal that is a rich feast. A feast with choice wines of select foods, rich in flavor of choice wines, well refined. The best of the best of the best. That's what God is waiting for us in his new creation. And so as Jesus came into this world, he seeks to get this world ready for that. He seeks to get us ready for that as he came to redeem and restore all things. And as he did that in a way that many people didn't understand. And throughout the centuries, many people still haven't understood or don't understand today. And those Pharisees, those religious leaders in Jesus' day, were some of the ones who just didn't understand. They probably said, why wouldn't he want to be with us? Look at us. Look at us with our nice, long, flowing robes. Look at us with our squeaky, clean lifestyles. Look at us, the people who are the best of the best of the best. Why wouldn't Jesus want to be with us? Why is he eating with those people? And that's what takes place during this meal at Matthew's house. The party must have been raucous enough that it got the attention of somebody who told somebody, and eventually that got back to the Pharisees because they show up. And they said, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Probably wagging a finger. Jesus answered, "Healthy people don't need a doctor, but sick people do. I didn't come to call righteous people, but sinners to change their hearts and lives." Healthy people don't need a doctor. Sick people do. And sometimes we're in denial that we need a doctor when we're sick. Anybody have that issue? Yeah, sometimes you say, oh, no, it's nothing. Oh, no, it's just allergies, it's just a head cold. Yeah, it might be walking pneumonia, but no, it's just walk it off, rub some dirt on it, right? We don't need a doctor. That was the attitude the Pharisees had. They figured we are checking all the boxes. We are checking the boxes for all 613 laws that we have extrapolated from the Torah. And we are living the good life. They weren't those tax collectors, those sinners, those other people that people look down their nose at, that people may have stepped aside and walked away from or gotten a little extra distance from because they didn't quite look quite right, they didn't act quite right, they didn't smell quite right, they didn't measure up to our expectations. That's who Jesus connected with in a lot of these meals. And it seems like he enjoyed those conversations. And so, yeah, he came as the doctor for people who knew that they were sick. And they knew they needed someone to heal them. And so Jesus redeemed and restored them and made them brand new. That's what he does for you and me. As Jesus brings us to the baptismal font, He makes us brand new. He redeems and restores us through water and his word, and gives us a new name as we're baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, as we're baptized into Christ. So we heard earlier from Isaiah 62, nations will see your righteousness, and you will be called by a new name, which the Lord's own mouth will determine. Others will see what God is doing. Others will see God's redemptive, restorative work in us as Jesus works in and through and around us as we go about our daily lives. And as they get closer and closer to us and we get closer and closer to them, there's an opportunity for them to get closer and closer to Jesus. So what is the mission of God? To redeem and restore all things. That's why Jesus came. To restore and redeem all things, to change people's hearts and lives and bring them into line with the good and gracious will of our Heavenly Father. And as Jesus does that, he gives us tools. He works through means. As Lutherans, we call these the means of grace. He works through baptism. He works through this meal. He works through his word. He works through community. As we gather together, as we build relationship with one another, as we not only eat with Jesus at his table, but we also eat with one another and enjoy getting caught up on what's been going on over the last week. And these are means to an end, and that end is a sending end. They are means to grow us in our faith and then send us back out on mission for another week. Send us back out on mission with Jesus. And that looks different for each one of us, just as it looked a little different for each of the disciples. You remember when when Jesus called Peter, James, and John, he made them a promise. He said, I will teach you how to fish for people. When he calls Matthew, he doesn't make that promise. Matthew might be terrible at fishing, but we know he can throw a good party. That's a gift, especially for the people who show up. We also know that he could apparently write, because he writes a biography of Jesus. And he writes it in such a way that he infuses a lot of the Jewish culture and faith into it, so that a Jewish audience can see Jesus as the Messiah in that. Matthew may not have been able to fish, but he could write, he could throw a party. He could do other things. And each one of you is also gifted. Gifted by God. And some of those gifts you go, a monkey could do this. Yeah, okay, I might be that monkey and I might not be able to do what you can do. You might think it's very simple, very easy, it naturally flows out of you. But for somebody else, they go, whew, I couldn't do that. But for somebody else, there's something else that they can do. That they think, well, it's so easy, a monkey can do it. That you go, I'm not even as good as a monkey then, because I can't do that. As Paul writes about gifts, he says there are different spiritual gifts, but the same Spirit. Okay, so there's one God that gives all these gifts. And there are different ministries and the same Lord. And there are different activities, but the same God who produces all of them in everyone. A demonstration of the Spirit is given to each person for the common good. Your gifts are not just for you. Your gifts are for other people. As we dug into Jesus' calling of Peter, James, and John, there was a quote from Luther that said that something to the effect that God changed Peter for the good. And he changed him not only for his own good, but for the good of others. And as Jesus redeems and restores you, as he redeems and restores me, as he gifts each of us with a unique set of gifts, he doesn't do that just for us. He doesn't do that even just for the people in here. Because as we gather in here, we're getting ready to go back out there. To be a blessing to the people we bump into the rest of the week. God gives gifts. And yet, at times, as we kind of sit on our gifts, it raises the question of, are we under the cycle for God's mission? As we look at what church culture looks like, and as Greg Finke quotes a book with a guy who was an atheist, went to church with his Christian friend, and he said, is this what Jesus said you should do? We've been convinced that we gather to come and sit. And we've been invited to bring our friends to come and sit. And yet we look at the Great Commission and Jesus says, as you're going, make disciples of all nations, baptizing and teaching them to obey what I've commanded you. And by the way, I'll be with you the whole way, every day. We've been conditioned to come and sit. Matthew didn't come and sit. He could have stayed sitting, but he got up and he went. And then he threw a party, and then he wrote a book, and he followed Jesus. And we don't know what else Matthew did because nobody bothered to write that down because, well, maybe it wasn't important. But he did other stuff. He could have stayed sitting, but he got up, left everything, and followed Jesus. He took advantage of an opportunity. So what opportunities is God laying at your footsteps? What opportunities are popping up in your everyday life as you rub shoulders with other people? Some of whom might be followers of Jesus, and some of whom might not be followers of Jesus yet. And what gifts has God given you? Do you know how to fish? Do you know how to write? Do you know how to throw a party? Do you know how to smile? Do you know how to encourage somebody? Do you know how to listen? All of these things are things that Jesus can use for the common good. When I got here this morning, I was working on my sermon, and Harold came in, and we had a chance to chat a little bit. And we chatted about a verse that has kind of been on his mind lately. It's Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And what is that verse again? Proverbs 3, 5, and 6.
Yes.
And it says,
trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not unto your own understanding. Acknowledge him in all your ways, and he will direct your paths.
okay, and he will direct your paths. And you were sharing with me that you're getting ready to travel to Arizona so you can be with Carrie during a surgery and escape the Montana cold. You didn't say that, but I know that's on your mind. And you've been going to the Lord to direct that path. And as you've prayed to God about this trip, he continues just lining everything up, right? And it's just playing out that way. And then you also shared that this is a concept and sometimes a verse that you'll share when you're out golfing with friends. And they'll be talking about, they have these plans and things. You say, well, I found that when I put my plans in God's hands when I pray, God makes things turn out well. And maybe you share some times of that as well. Okay? And you're joining Jesus on his mission when you are doing that. Jesus is in that. He's in the mix of that. So maybe you have the gift of golfing and the gift of gab like Harold does. Or maybe you have other gifts. But Jesus is in those things. And he's laying out opportunities for us to be able to live out his redemptive, restorative mission among other people. Ray Finke writes in his book, we're not called to everywhere, but to somewhere. We are not called to everyone, but to someone. Jesus was called to Peter, James, John, Matthew, and others. But who is that person that God is calling you to? Who is that one person that God keeps either putting in your path or bringing up in your mind? And how can you connect with them so that they can get connected with Jesus? That's a question for today. A couple other questions for you to ponder. I encourage you again, you can discuss these at Bible study. It beats talking politics, at least it does for me. Maybe it doesn't for you, but it does for me. What are you good at? See, you may want to ask somebody, hey, what are you good at? What are something that you're really good at? And how can God use that, right? I absolutely hate the game of golf, but I am happy that God works through the game of golf and Harold to share Jesus with other people, okay? What are you good at? And how can God use that? And how can you join Jesus in what he's already doing? How can you be that next person that drops a little water of grace into somebody's life as Jesus is pursuing them to get connected with them? Food for thought.